Haymarket is a nonprofit publishing company that was founded about 11 years ago. Our mission is to publish books for changing the world, which means that we have a little bit of a different mission than most publishers. We don't look for the possibility of profit in a book. That's not the first thing we think about. What we think about is this going to be useful to activists who are trying to figure out the world and actually change it? And because of that, actually, we've had a bit of a different experience than most other publishers in the past few years. While we keep hearing about the publishing industry going down, 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 Haymarket Books actually has been exploding, where more and more people are finding us. It's been very exciting. And more people are finding us, we're selling more books, we're reaching more new people, more new organizations. It's been great, particularly since the explosion of the Occupy movement, kind of the global revolts. So it's particularly exciting to be able to publish books, not just for a new market, but actually for a new age bracket, where we can start publishing books for young adults, where there is a number of really good materials, but still there's holes, there's always room to add. And we took inspiration for this from Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States, People's History Project, where we wanted to actually put the lives of people who had changed the world in the hands of young people, so they could see maybe themselves in there, they could see some stories, they could maybe see some narratives that they don't ordinarily see in their textbooks or in their books. I hope everybody gets a chance to look through it. I think it's a fantastic book. It's a real achievement. We're very proud to have published it, particularly and kept the price point very low. Usually these books cost quite a bit. So with that, I just want to say thank you everybody for coming. We're very excited for the book. Hopefully enjoy the presentation.
So, Pedro and I are going to be your co-hosts here today. My name is Brian Jones. I'm a teacher and activist here in New York City. Been teaching in public schools for 9 years. I'm a member of a group, a social justice caucus in the United Federation of Teachers called the Movement of Rank and File Educators. Pedro is a public school, as a middle school public school student. And also you might recognize his name or face from the publication Indy Kids. Pedro's a regular contributor and Changemakers. Let's welcome Pedro.
Yeah, my name is Pedro. I'm a 7th grader in New York City, 12 years old. So yeah, this is under one Changemakers. I'll talk about it. So yeah, I mean, it's an interesting book, mostly because, it talks about people you don't necessarily hear about in school. I mean, there's people like Colin Keller or Brendan's opinion it. So you hear about them in school, and you know kind of what they did. This goes into more detail, and then some by talking about, people you don't necessarily hear about in school, and that you didn't know about, and that and have made a difference, even though they're not in history books and stuff.
Yes, so true. As a teacher myself, I could say I've been waiting for a book like this for a really long time. I've heard many an aspiring Haymarket author get a kind of talking to from the editors, like, basically, look, you're trying to write a book, look at the books that we've got and think to yourself, what's missing? And so I was really excited to have an opportunity to contribute to this book. The challenge was to write about some of these change makers. I got to write 2 of them. To write about them in 500 words or less. What happened in their life, what makes them a change maker, aim it at a kind of middle school audience in terms of the language and terminology. And so I sent off my little contribution. I couldn't wait for it to come out. But when I saw this book, when I actually got my hands on it, it was so much more physically arresting, beautiful, aesthetically pleasing, and inviting a book than I really understood it would be. There's a coming together of form and function here that I think is going to make you, I just leave it out of my house, and anybody who comes through has to pick it up, and then immediately gets lost in what? Whoa, oh my goodness, Crispus Attucks? I didn't know. I mean, it's that kind of a book. It's made for that kind of discovery, in my experience already holding the book. So we're going to encourage everybody here to think about, as soon as I had my hands on it, I just thought, wow, every teacher I know has to have a copy of this book in their classroom. So I really want to encourage you to think about who is it you know who has to have this book in their classroom, and buy at least 2 copies today. One for yourself and one for one of those other people or more. I think the Haymarket is offering a deal for people who made it through the snow today. The regular price for one is $20, but if you buy 2, they'll give them to you for $30. Now let's see, the rest of what I wanted to say is on my little device here. Oh yes. Well, first of all, I also just want to give a round of applause. We have 2 of the Changemakers featured in this book here today. Bhairavi, Desai, who contributed to this book here. This is a book not only about Changemakers, it's by Changemakers. Can you just raise your hand if you contributed one or more pieces to this book? Yes, let's give these people a round of applause. The ideas here that people that you knew from history, but maybe you didn't know some of their more radical ideas or actions. You didn't know the radical edge behind people like Helen Keller, or Albert Einstein, or even Martin Luther King. Some of these people from history who've been really defanged in our popular history texts. And then so many people who've been forgotten or marginalized. I think a lot of young people are going to see people who made change who didn't necessarily do it in the English language, who made important changes here in the United States, but were not born here. Were people who look differently than most of the people who are on the mainstream networks and in a lot of the mainstream history textbooks. So there's a lot of diversity of voices and a lot of forgotten voices in this book. And I really think that this is a moment when we cannot take for granted that tradition of people's history that Howard Zinn popularized, that this book stands in that tradition at a moment where frankly that tradition is under attack. I was disappointed as a member of the American Federation of Teachers. I was disappointed to see that in their last issue they spent 8 pages attacking Howard Zinn as a bad historian. So we really cannot take this kind of history for granted. We have to defend the idea of people's history, the idea that ordinary kids and young people have been central to making change in history, that they can and are interested in these kinds of ideas. And frankly, at a moment when they are trying to standardize and focus everything in schools on drill, kill, and prepare for the test, we need to say that no, Pearson does not have all the answers that we need in our society. Actually, we have many of the answers, and much of what we have to learn is going to be in a struggle to change our world. That's how we're going to learn, and that the young people today more than ever need to discover that tradition of change making. They must be change makers if they're going to make the world a livable place. So with that, I want to introduce one of the editors of this book. Unfortunately, Michelle Bollinger could not make it today because of the snow, but we do have Dow Tran. Now, yes. If you are familiar with Haymarket Books, and if you're not familiar, you need to get familiar with. There's many books in the back. Dow's name is tucked inside many of those books. She's an editor for Haymarket Books and is one of the reasons that the books are of such high quality. And finally, I think it's nice, finally, after all this time, to see Dow's name on the cover of one of our books. And for her to get the recognition for all of her hard work. This really was a real labor of love. Dow's going to talk more about the process, but please welcome Dow Tran.
Thanks to both Pedro and Brian. It's a lovely welcome. I'm so happy to be here with all of you today, and I can't think of a better space to be in, really. I mean, notes all over about power and privilege and oppression and inspirational quotes, and I think it's just really wonderful. We're always looking for ways to connect what we do, as book publishers, as book people, to activists and to actual social struggles that are happening. So it's really wonderful to be in this space. So I hope you'll bear with me. I'm used to working on the page, speaking in front of large groups of people or small groups of people. Anyway, I grew up in Philadelphia many moons ago. I was the youngest in a family of 8 children who were refugees from Vietnam. We lived in West Philadelphia. I don't know if people are familiar with the geography there, but it's a mainly African American neighborhood, and even as a young person, it was really obvious to me that there's so much about my history and the history of my peers, my neighbors, my friends that wasn't reflected in our schools. I went to a public school called the Middle Years Alternative for the Humanities. I was super lucky to have an exceptional teacher for social studies who introduced me to Zinn's People's History of the United States. And probably a lot of you will agree with me that it was a life and perspective changing book. Today I'm a parent of a kindergartner, and even though she goes to one of the few public progressive schools in New York City, I know that because of the overarching context of relentless education, quote-unquote, reforms and races to the top, we as parents have to be pretty vigilant about making sure that our kids get an education that focuses on substance and not test-taking, that focuses on teaching critical thinking, not rote memorization, that focuses on valuing our ethnic and racial diversity in history, that considers the full story, for instance, about why Vietnam is not just a war, it's an actual country. We need to help, today's generation that's coming up learn the richer, more complex history of the civil rights struggle in this country. And over the years we've seen excellent resources come out. I don't know if people are familiar with Rethinking Schools and Teaching for Change. They've come out with excellent, helpful designs for curriculum, uncovering these hidden histories, excellent books that really bring out to light some of the amazing stories of individuals. I could name a whole bunch, but just a few. Ann Petry's Harriet Tubman, conductor of the Underground Railroad, Nikki Giovanni's Rosa, Sit-In, how 4 friends stood up by sitting down, Si se puede. There's a bunch of books that do deal with that, but we thought for this project that what was needed didn't yet exist at all was a more comprehensive collection of stories about standout individuals in this country's history that could give us a deeper taste, more complex perspective. So we see this book as part of that, contribution of growing resources for students, for educators, for parents, and we want to make sure that kids don't just learn the sanitized, dare I say it, quite boring, traditional history that features just dead white men. There's some of them in the book, but they're exceptional. We know that the teaching of history is always subjective, right? Just as much in what it states as in what it leaves out. And I'm saying this as a former student as well as a parent, and as one of the many contributing writers. We wish that 101 Changemakers existed when we were kids. One reviewer put it this way recently. She said, people of color, LGBT folks, women, youth, and artists, people whose stories my middle-class self would have devoured faster than Lunchables, because they were reflections of myself and of people I love. These people are represented in Changemakers. So I think we were pretty successful in some ways in our goal to seek out and raise up lesser known, lesser heard voices. And in coming up with the list of who to include, Michelle and I, we would have wanted 1,001 Changemakers, but obviously there are real limitations of time, size, cost that meant we had to make some hard choices. Our bottom line criteria was that the individuals that we included had to be rebels and radicals. So you'll see Tom Paine, but you won't see George Washington. Rachel Carson, but not Ayn Rand. Elvira Arellano, but not Bobby Jindal, and so on. You get my point. I want to just take a minute to talk about someone who's not in the book, Christopher Columbus. We launched this book 3 months ago, I think it was 3 months ago, in DC, and it actually launched on Columbus Day. And one of the reasons that Columbus Day really gets under our skin is because it's a flashpoint, right? And I don't know, Brian probably agrees with me. For educators, it's one simple story that you get all the lies and all the distortions that are then generalized to the teaching of U.S. history. And it's not just in history class, but it's in a more general discussion about, what our country is, how it was founded, who built it. So in the typical elementary or middle school textbook, Columbus is portrayed as someone who happened onto the shores of the New World accidentally, as in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Students might learn that Columbus and the explorers came for a friendly trading habit. They wanted to barter for goods. It was a good deal for everyone and no one was hurt. They just happened to leave out the killing habit and the slaving habit. And if those things are acknowledged, they happen by accident. So there's no general cohesive story that's being laid out that's more truthful. Not at all related to the mission of the colonization of the Americas. The Columbus story reminds us how, I think, incredibly damaging people and events are portrayed or can be portrayed. And then the victims, or sometimes survivors, are never given their due, never given a spotlight in the history. So with this book, we really focused on those stories. We really wanted to discuss more than just the oppression of victims. We wanted to talk about how sometimes people didn't see themselves as victims, but as fighters, as resistors. That was very important for us. So, I think now people are maybe more likely to roll their eyes at Columbus and say, oh, he went the wrong way, laugh at how stupid he was, but there's still a big disconnect, right, between what he did and what happened in the years that followed. So rather than let that disconnect continue unchallenged, we tried to highlight people, Tecumseh, Sitting Bull, Geronimo, modern day fighters like Leonard Peltier, Mary and Carrie Dan. People may know the Dans were Shoshone sisters who fought for the preservation of their lands against the US government. They fought not just for tribal lands, but also for the rights of the environment. And obviously this meeting taking place at this time, also very important to think about the relationship that we have to the environment. Again, we highlighted their stories as resistance fighters, and our book is full of others like them. We did our best to make sure that the writing was accessible and clear. And Brian's, I have to say, were among the best in the book. I should note that we definitely see the potential for the readership of this book being age 9 and up. Definitely people coming out of all walks of life, and it's the kind of book I really appreciate because it doesn't talk down to its readership. It's not condescending in the least, so somebody, an adult learner of English, could get as much out of this book as a middle schooler, I think. It's been adopted by various people around the country in a slow but sure way. Teachers in a Portland high school, I got an email the other day, they said they're using it in their critical skills team, which is wonderful. A graduate student has incorporated this book as a basis of a model for her model school. That was also wonderful to hear. So anyway, to me, it's a really useful resource if you want to get around all the stuff about aligning curriculums. In a way, it's good because there is talk about using nonfiction and using biography more. So I say if they're going to use it, let's hope they use this. Let's see, I'm going to try to skip ahead because I know we're running out of time. So just a couple examples, the gross misrepresentation of our history. The story of the Hawaiian Islands and Queen Liliuokalani. There's some textbooks will just say, oh, she gave up the lands to the United States. So, but what were the terms on which she, quote unquote, gave up these lands? Is the word conquer ever used to describe what happened? Is there a description of, the force that was behind the request to give up the land? Michelle, the co-editor, relates a story about a textbook that she uses in her class that's actually pretty decent. It's Alan Brinkley's American History, a Survey. It has a section on rap music. Not around when I was growing up, so I think in many ways that's an improvement. So in this book, he says, Chuck D and other successful rappers use their music to encourage young black men to avoid drugs and crime, to take responsibility for their children to get an education. And I'm no expert on hip hop, but that is a far cry from Fight the Power. So you can see how even an example of a well-meaning inclusion, right, in this kind of progressive, inclusive history, it still manages to get it quite wrong, I think. Not that there's anything wrong with saying those things, but for that to be the summary or the focus of Chuck D's importance, I'll leave it to you to read what we say about him. So, given that we're doing this in Black History Month, I also think it's important to say a few things. Brian alluded to how, a figure like Martin Luther King is really whitewashed and sanitized. He's absolutely a hero, right? He deserves to be as much of a household name as he is. But I think that if you talk about getting into his development after the Montgomery bus boycott and the nonviolent marches to defeat segregation, most textbooks don't include his Riverside speech. And for me, it's like, how do you understand the development of the anti-war movement in this country if you do not read that speech? That to me is a major missing link connecting point. And many people don't even know about this speech or know about how he came out against the war in Vietnam. So I'm going to skip some of this other stuff. There's so many people in here that I would love to talk to you about and let you know about. But the last thing I want to touch on before we get into our discussions with our Changemakers, which we're so honored to have with us today, is that there's so many people who are left out of our nation's history, and one of the many things that we love about both Howard Zinn and Studs Terkel is their emphasis on making ordinary people and their lives the center of their work, the center of what they would like to, let other people know about. We included some of these people in our book, some of which I didn't know about enough, and like in the process of doing the book, learned a ton more about. Barbara Young and Bhairavi Desai are two of those people. There are changemakers out there all the time. I feel like their stories are waiting to be heard. And our hope is that if young people have more and more access to this history, to our history, they can both be inspired and emboldened, really, to improve their communities and their own lives. I think that's, for us, really what education is about. It's not about data or test scores. It's about people realizing their full potential and having a say in that and having support for that. So with that, I'd love to invite Barbara to come up. So how did you become an activist and an organizer?
Barbara Young. I came to the U.S. from Barbados in the Caribbean, and before I got to the U.S. in Barbados, I was a bus conductor. I worked for the government and the transport system, and I was a union organizer, a delegate in the workers' union, and I sat on the executive council of the Barbados Workers Union. So it was a comfortable job. And after what happened is the economic situation changed, and the IMF and the World Bank they said they have to cut back on goods and services. And as a result, 943 conductors got laid off the buses, and they replaced us with fare boxes. So they make all the buses one-person operated buses, then you come in and you put the money in the fare boxes, they import all these boxes. So not having work to support myself, I decided to come to the US. I joined my daughter, she was already in the US. And I came here and I started to work as an elder caregiver. I worked with a family in Forest Hills and for 1 year, and then after that job came to an end, I went on to be a child care provider. Went to an agency, they sent me, and I became a child care provider. And I worked with that family for 7 years. And when I went to that family, it was like one child, one 13-month-old, and 4 years after, they had another child. And although I wasn't compensated for the second one, which I had from an infant out of the hospital, and I stayed with them. When I was leaving that job, I would have to say, I wanted to go home to my country, spend like a month or two, come back and get another start, because this was a living job and I was in that job. And sometimes when you're in a job and you love the children you're working with, it is so hard to be torn away from them. And you see how the children look up to you and they love you and you care for them. And I like to tell this story of the little boy. When he was 5 years old, his mother had a kid when he was 4, so the little baby is 1 year and sitting on her lap. And they asked me if I would stay over the weekend because he was doing karate and moving up from one belt to another and had to sit through the whole program. And they wanted me to stay there. And I said, okay, I will stay. And we all went on the Saturday morning to see him do his program. And when the adults write down to the children, when it gets to the children and he finished, they tie the new belt on him. And just as everybody up here was doing the performance, we were sitting at the back of the room, like over there where that lady is sitting, and he ran straight across the room. And halfway across the room, he says, Barbara, you're proud of me? and he'd come and jump on my lap. And I was sitting there, his mom was there with the baby, and his dad was there. And, and he just turned back and went back. And his mom, after the whole show finished, she said to him, "No, Brian, can I have my congratulatory hug?" And he said yes, and he hugged her then. But only to show you how close that these kids get attached to you. And then the other thing that happened, I leave that job and I went home and I came back and I got other jobs, working in other jobs. And now I'm working in the city, and this young lady, she came up to me, and I'm with a baby, and the job was a crappy job. More or less, yes. The baby, I started now and the baby is 5 weeks old, but I had to sleep in the same room with the baby. So instead of getting paid for 24 hours, because I got to get about every 3 hours during the night to feed the baby, and I'm only getting paid for the day and not the night. So I'm doing what I love, because this is a kid, you know, and I go take the baby in the stroller and I go to the playground. This lady come up to me and she says, "I'm from Domestic Workers United, and we're doing a training for nannies." And I said, I got experience. She said, and she said, you have experience, but this is a certificate course at Hunter College, and you get a certificate, you know. I said, okay, I'll do it. I did it, and I went to the organization first to check out what they were doing, and they were meeting every third Saturday of the month, once a month. And I never looked back, because the things that they were talking about, I could see so much wrong in the work that I was doing. And I didn't know that most of it, although you can meet good intention employers, not all employers are bad employers, but there was no laws or guidelines for employers to follow. And it was because domestic workers were an excluded segment of workers. And this happened 1935. It happened again when the laws was amended in 1975, when the Fair Labor Standard Act gave more rights to other workers. It exclude domestic workers and farm laborers again from the laws. And so this is something that just fired me up to know that we've got to do something about it. We got to make some of the wrongs right. And one of the things that we sit down as an organization and did was, there's so many of us in there that are undocumented. So the only way we can do is try to change the laws. Try to change the laws, because what the laws say, it include every worker. And so we decide, sit down, get 200 women in a room and decide we're gonna ask these women what would make the job a better job. And there was so much things that they come up with. Notice and severance, paid vacation and public holidays. And the list went on and on. But one of the things that happened, women were complaining about, is that some of the employers were saying, when it comes to Thanksgiving, it's not your holiday. You're not American. When it comes to July 4th, it's not your holiday. This is an American holiday. And then they had some people that wanted to take Easter off, because that was the holiday celebrated as a religious holiday. And they couldn't get that, because if some people that they were working with was of the Jewish faith and they had already celebrated Passover, they were not going to give the worker the Easter holiday. So it was a combination of stuff that we decide we need laws to govern the industry. And so it took us 6 years. 6 years of building community, of building with other organizations, of building with schools, with colleges. We built with employers because we didn't want to push back. We built with an organization here in New York called Jews for Racial and Economic Justice. And they organize domestic worker employers and ask them to be good employers to the people they hire. And so after we went to the unions and we got SEIU, 32BJ, they represent doormen in these buildings and around the city, and we got them, the doormen, to give the domestic workers in the building the flyers as they come out, because the doorman was familiar with who was working in the building. And we went to the churches. We know people work all week and they come home, especially for live-out workers, they want to go to worship on Sunday. And we created a program called Domestic Workers in the Pulpit. Yeah. So we went to them, to the churches, and we get them to get a domestic worker to come in and talk about the work and what we were doing in the churches. And with all of this, we built a whole big coalition and went to Albany. Got to Albany, and the ministers in Albany, the senators, the assembly people, they didn't know what we were talking about. We're talking about domestic workers, people who work in other people's homes. But we are saying they're asking us if domestic violence. We said no. People who take care of other people. Some people are taking care of kids, some people are taking care of the elderly. Some people are cleaning. So we are talking about these people that are being left out of labor laws in this country, and we need labor laws to protect them. And one of the things they wanted to know if we want special, is there special benefits for domestic workers? No, we're not seeking anything special. We're seeking to be included in the labor laws. So 6 years into it, Governor Patterson, at first the fourth year, we did get a sponsor in the Senate. The Assembly passed a portion of the bill. After asking us to cut, they passed a portion of the bill. And then we got a sponsor in Senator Diane Savina, who represents Brooklyn, Staten Island. And she got the Senate in 2 years' time to pass the complete bill. So then the two bills had looked different. So they had to come together and decide what they would really give to make it one bill in order to put it on the governor's desk. And Governor Patterson signed the bill into law, so domestic workers now in New York have 3 days paid days off. They're included in the state overtime law, and they can't be paid less than the minimum wage. And they have the possibility to come together and collectively bargain. But this has been a challenge because you have to have, like, where only one employer or one employee to one employer or two employees to one employer. So this has posed a challenge. But there's many ways that we are working around this. And Governor Patterson took all the whole contingent of domestic worker up to Harriet Tubman because he said she changed a lot of history by helping people in the underground out of the South. And he took us there when he signed the domestic workers bill into law. So New York domestic workers is the only domestic workers in the country now that are governed by any laws in this country. We tried it again in California, 2 years, and last year the governor in California, Jerry Brown, he vetoed the bill when it get to his desk after it passed both houses. We're gonna put that bill back in again and try another time. We have now Massachusetts is about to put in a domestic workers bill. Illinois want to put in a domestic workers bill, and there are quite a few states that want to go forward who a lot of work have to be done to build on the ground first before they can try any kind of legislation. So to make changes, it is hard, but you got to be determined to stand up for what you know is right. And you got to stand up. What makes, I always hear, I should say, that a squeaky wheel is the one that gets the oil. And if you don't say anything, then nothing will happen. And although domestic work is so important to this country, because we look, you can look at it this way. Since 2011, October of 2011, when baby boomers began to turn 65, every 8 seconds, according to statistics, somebody in this country turns 65. And the amount of people that's going to be needing care 20 years from now, there is going to be a need, a huge need for care workers. And we want care workers to be comfortable in the jobs they're doing. We want to have them trained that they can give proper care and good care, and we want the people that are receiving care to be able to have good care also. So this is like a mission that we are looking at right now in this country. And I'm sorry if I take up too much of your time. As you said, the slogan that we use is, we do the work that make all of the work possible. And the reason that we say this, domestic workers are hired by most people who are the professionals in this country. And we're dealing with New York State. And who hires a domestic worker that want our needs a one-on-one with their kid, rather than putting them in a center or child care. So the fact that the employers need a one-on-one, doctors, lawyers, people in the educators, people in the financial market who have to leave home at 7 o'clock in the morning, and domestic workers have to be there before that employer leaves. And 6:30 in the evening, and the domestic worker looking to go home, because all day they take care of those children. They, for the ones that got to go to school, they got to drop them off at school, they got to pick them up from school, they got to do the laundry, they got to clean. They pick them up from school, and then it's after school this, after school that, after school. And then they get home to the house, they feed them, they bathe them, the parents come in and they're already in pajamas. And sometimes they're waiting to go home, and the parents call and say, oh look, I'm so sorry, I have a meeting after work. So instead of going home at 6:30 in the evening, now we're going home at 9 o'clock. So we always say, without the domestic worker, New York would come to a halt. Because if you don't have that person to turn up at your house in the morning, to take over your household while you go, and it becomes hard And then we encourage domestic workers. You know, your job is very valuable. Your job is very valuable, and and it should be respected, and people should recognize that it is real work. One of the things that don't happen is it never look at like real work because it's in the home.
That's right.
And work in the home was never really a paid job. But now this is not a part of your family that's helping out.
Right.
This is a stranger that coming into your home
Right.
that is doing some work for you and allowing you to go on and do your work. And when it comes to young people, I say, as I said just before, you know, stand up for what you know is right. And if you see some person doing something that can lift up humanity, we just celebrated Dr. Martin Luther King. And he talked about work, he talked about humanity, he talked about love, and he talked about many things. And he said that if you are doing work that lift up humanity, then it has value and it has worth. So I always tell, as an organizer, now with the National Domestic Workers Alliance, I always tell people, look at what you're doing. It is important. You know, talk to the employer. If you have a relationship with your employer, talk to your employer, because many times I didn't talk to my employer. Because people say, why you saying the job, and you know the job wasn't good. I didn't talk to my employer. I just look at the kids that I was working with, and just feel that I just felt that they needed me.
Right.
They needed me. They loved their show to me. The last job I just before I become an organizer, I left that job because the hours had cut back, and I couldn't pay my bills on the hours that cut back. But a very good family, but most of all, leaving them wasn't as hard as leaving the little girl. I had her from 6 weeks old, and I was leaving now she was 8 years. And she cried. She cried, and I cried. But I cried mostly because what she was saying to me. Because she was saying, Barbara, you promised me you would stay with me. Who breaks a promise? And now you're leaving. And she cried so much. She wanted me to stay. I said, but you're a big girl now, you're 8 years old. I still need you. I need you. You know, and but it was nothing that I could do at the time. I just had to move on, you know, and I cry when I leave her. And if I go to the west side of Manhattan and she see me, whoo, she come and she's holding me so tight, you know, and it's like, what, over 2 years now I leave her. But I leave the job. But I think that she to me, she's still in my heart, and she still loves me, and I still love her because of how close we were. And when the parents tell her that the job was coming to an end, they tell me she cried, she laughed, she recount everything that we did together, wherever we went together, and the next day for school, her mom went and told the teacher that they had tell her that the nanny, she wasn't going to have the nanny anymore, because if she had act strange in school, that the teacher would know what was causing it. But she's fine. She's fine. She's such a nice kid.
You're not the typical taxi driver, and yet you are a sort of the main organizer for taxi workers in this city. So maybe you could tell people a little about that.
Sure. Well, first I just wanted to say hello to everybody. So that was just amazing. All of your comments were so amazing. And I have to say, when we received the book in the mail in the office, we our movement be reflected and, you know, among just such amazing people like Barbara and all the other activists that are there. And I have to say, I feel like none of us stop being students, right? One way or another, we're always being taught. And I am also one of those people who felt like, God, I wish this had been around when I was growing up. But I'm so thankful that it's around while I'm still growing up. You know? So really glad it's out there. So I started organizing taxi workers when I was 23. I joined an organization at the time that was working on a project with drivers. But within about a year and a half, we left there. In 1998, we independently formed the Taxi Workers Alliance. And you know, I'm a daughter of immigrant workers. My family and I migrated to the States in 1979, and we're originally from India. And you know, I saw, you know, just my father for a long time struggled to find work, and we, you know, lived pretty poor, just surviving on my mom's paycheck when she was a factory worker. And eventually, yeah, this is in New Jersey. And you know, eventually my father sold everything that was back home to have a little bit of money to basically buy like a one-aisle small store in a really small working class town. And that, you know, that's how we survived. But for me, you know, seeing my mom struggle, especially being a factory worker, and I always say this, you know, when children of factory workers will tell you when your parents first come home, you don't really look at their eyes, you look at their hands, and you see what's happened on the assembly line. And we just always knew that if my mom worked in a union shop, there'd be a Band-Aid. And when she didn't work in a union shop, you know, there would be the wounds. And so just, you know, as I was growing up, that just, it really changed my perspective. For me, the union movement, this was the group of people who were among the first to kind of welcome us into America, right? Because my mom's coworkers, most of them were immigrant women themselves, but they were also the people that kept my mom safe. And so I always had, you know, I think a particular love for that movement, but I didn't necessarily want to go into it. You know, when I went to Rutgers in New Jersey, and you know, I was part of the women's movement. I was really active. And even when I was younger, you know, one of the things I really appreciate about the book is the idea of it's about the images. And I think especially when you're younger, there's such a power to, right, we're so curious about how we look and how we're going to turn out to look as we get older and, you know, as you're growing up. And, you know, we never had, right, I never had images of like, certainly South Asian women or even Asian women or even like women of color in general. Certainly not poor people. And so for me, when I was growing up, and I was it must have been your age at the time, you know, there was the Sandinista revolution was going on in Nicaragua. And I would see the images of, you know, Nicaraguan people in resistance. And I didn't really understand it, right? But I would see the images, and it was like poor brown people that looked like me. But what really captivated me was like the sense of fierceness. There was that, you know, there was a sense of pride, you know. And growing up, you know, we always heard stories like from my grandmother about the anti-colonial movement in India, and she would get, you know, she was a really traditional woman. But here was this extremely traditional woman who'd end up in jail because she was marching against the British. And so I think all of that really just kind of, I feel like it always showed me that another world was possible. And it really wasn't until I was older that I realized that was the other world, right? Because that for me was the norm. The idea that people standing up and, you know, fighting for change and recognizing justice, and, you know, imperialism was as popular as saying, you know, what's for dinner, right? Like it wasn't political jargon. It was people's reality. So by the time I was older, I knew I wanted to be an organizer. You know, I couldn't imagine really doing anything else. I feel so fortunate that I get paid for it. I mean, You know, I get to get into trouble every day, and my parents can still be proud of me. You know. So when we started organizing taxi workers, when I went to Rutgers, I studied history and women's studies. You get a women's studies degree and you go and organize men, because that's really, you know, because if you're going to organize men, you kind of better be a feminist and have a, you know, it helps to have the women's studies degree, you know. But the drivers were just amazing. People were just amazing. You know, when I first started, and you know, we didn't have flyers, I didn't have business cards for like 10 years, and you know, nothing on me. Didn't know anything about the industry, right? I still don't have a driver's license. I know nothing about the streets. And I would go out and talk to drivers, and they were my teachers. Back then, there were no books about the industry. They were my teachers. They were the people that taught me, you know, not only about the industry, but about such a deep sense of like humanity and humor, right? I mean, this is one of the workforces, I feel like, besides educators, actually, who have been so demonized within the mainstream of our society. I mean, I feel really proud that I think a lot of our organizing has come to change that. But we first went out on strike in '98, and before then, every year, there was, you know, on all the tabloids, like the 10 worst taxi drivers, and you open up, there'd be spreads of like copies of the hack licenses, which look like mugshots, you know? I mean, you never see that about all the Wall Street guys, right? I mean, imagine all the pride, like the Daily News and the Post could have taken, like, see, we told you people years ago, you know, they had like run these articles before, right? So we, you know, but drivers are so aware of that, right? Like that public lashing, right? But have such a sense of like humanity about it, and such a sense of humor about it, and such a, you know, that sense of dignity. And particularly, you know, someone who grew up poor, I mean, though I'd never been a taxi driver, I would be considered second-generation immigrant. I'm not from, most 60% of the drivers are from South Asia, but I don't speak the regional language that most drivers speak, and I'm from Gujarat. Most South Asian drivers are from Punjab or Bengal. And then, you know, so I was 23, most drivers were much older than me, but I felt like I'd come home. And I'd go to the airport, and I'd spend time at the taxi lot, and the conversations I'd get to have, it was like sitting, you know, it was like sitting in our apartment, and the conversations I'd get to have with my father and my mother and my, you know, uncles and aunties about life and about resistance and about how they saw the world. And for me, really fundamentally, that's the universality of the human experience, right? It's about when we're able to connect with that, and particularly when you're able to connect deeper with your own sense of humanity, right? Because of how someone reaches out to you. And so we started organizing, and you know, within a year we built up a really strong membership base. 1998 we went out on strike. Similar to taxi workers, as Barbara is describing for domestic workers, we're also excluded from collective bargaining rights. And that's because we're independent contractors. But we've gone out one by one to build up our membership, and now from 1998 to today, we have a membership of over 16,000 registered members. We've gone out on strike several times. We've had so many demonstrations. I mean, Giuliani like knew us by first name basis, just hated us. I mean, I doubt he hated us as much as we hated him. I feel like at some point in his heart there just was no feeling left, good or bad, you know. But you know, he would call us taxi terrorists when we first went out on strike. So did his police commissioner, so did the chairperson of the Taxi Limousine Commission, brought out the National Guard, NYPD, and you know, at the time, INS, immigration, when we went out on strike and had our motorcades, and there's been so much, you know, repression, you know, and attacks toward our movement and this is just from our public officials, right? The state. So you can imagine how private capital has reacted to us. But we have a really, we have an amazing team. And I have to say, one of the things that when you open up the book, and we felt so proud that we were reflected as a movement. But that really is. I mean, I'm really fortunate that I get to have my name in it. But really, it's the movement. It's the struggle of like tens of thousands of people that are able to uplift, any of our causes and the names of any of our organizations. So, and actually one of those people who's really been one of the great guiding forces in my life happens to be here today. Not to embarrass him, but my wonderful friend and teacher, Bill Lindauer. Bill's an organizing committee member and a former staff, 30-year taxi veteran, and the official resident troublemaker. We're all really jealous because we all want that title.
If you could talk a little bit about some of the obstacles that you faced and how you overcame them, if you overcame them, and maybe talking a little bit more about like what enables you and Bill and others who are part of this movement to persevere. Because I mean, I'm sure people in this room know it's not always been easy, and it's quite challenging and difficult and depressing, and all that.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is we lose more than we win, right? But it's the eyes on the prize. I mean, if you don't. I think if we do this because we believe in it, right? Like we have a goal, and we keep fighting until we reach that goal. But the truth is, like, once we get to that goal, we're gonna find another goal. So it's not. I mean, to me, it's not the result. It's the cause that carries us forward. We have tremendous obstacles. I mean, so there's 13,237 yellow taxis in New York City. It's by far the biggest taxi market in the entire world. And there's 50,000 taxi driver license holders, out of whom about 30,000 are full-time workers. So, the state, the Taxi and Limousine Commission, which regulates our industry, has pretty much created its own surplus pool of labor, because it's practically double the number of jobs in the industry. We don't really have traditional jobs. We have rentals, because every day drivers begin at a negative. They pay between $130 to $190 for the lease of the taxi and the medallion, plus to pay for gasoline. Now, those are the basics. Then there's other expenses, like if the car breaks down, nobody's going to pay you for that time. And 60 to 70% of the vehicles on the street, the repairs, the services, the actual cost, as well as the time that goes into it, all of that is borne by the driver. So we, not only do we have we have no paychecks, but we don't even have any guaranteed income. So all of this is a change. I mean, over the past 30 years, up until 1979, we were structured under what's called the commission system. So whatever was on the meter would be split 50-50, 60-40, depending on seniority and the garage. And as commission workers, you were considered an employee under the National Labor Relations Board, and so there was a union contract at the time. And there were other benefits and all. The union sold out the workers, which the union agreed to the transition from commission into leasing. Now the rank and file voted that down, so the union brought in the pensioners and said that you're gonna get a better pension from this, and that's how they ratified that transition. And like many transitions, it was an economically violent one from 79 to the mid 80s. And there used to be garages in this, north of this area, but on the west side in Midtown. And overnight, entire workforces were fired. And you can, now the main capital in our industry is the number you see on top of the cab, the medallion. In 1971, when the Taxi and Limousine Commission was first chartered by the City Council, the medallion was valued at less than $30,000. We were under commission system at the time. You know, there was incomes and benefits, collective bargaining, all of that, right? But today, that same piece of tin is now valued at over 1.5 million. And you can trace the development of that capital with the recruitment, concentrated recruitment of immigrant workers of color, and the change from commission into leasing. Because what leasing did is, not only did the bosses no longer have personnel expenses, right? There's no salaries, no tax contribution, healthcare, none of that. But also, it meant that the costs of the business now get placed on the drivers. So, you know, the risks were socialized and the profits were privatized, right? And so, yeah, sounds familiar, right?
Similar to the domestic, anyway.
And so the structure of the work itself becomes an obstacle, because laws are then created to maintain that status quo. And, you know, workers have to find, you know, so many creative ways to make those changes. The fact that, I mean, we're a workforce, we're probably the most ethnically diverse workforce in the city of New York. You know, drivers collectively speak over 150 different languages. You know, one language is struggle, but you know, there's so many ethnic differences. And to give you a sense, I mean, in 1998 when we went out on strike, you know, India and Pakistan, we've been mortal enemies, right? Thanks to the British. And so we've had so many wars against each other. In 1998, you know, while our governments were busy impoverishing the public and testing the bomb, we here were trying to organize ourselves in unity to stand up against the economic oppression of taxi drivers. And so when we first started, for example, you go into the airport lot and there would be ethnic groups and people wouldn't really connect or talk with each other. So we used to go as a group, we'd basically do like street theater and, you know, plan it out that we'd always have a diverse team of us. And one person would kind of play the really inquisitive soul, one person would be the complete skeptic, you know, one person would make sure that everyone is kind of listening, right? And when we would have meetings, if we were meeting with Pakistani drivers, we'd only meet at a Bangladeshi restaurant, because that's actually where the most recent tension is, because between Pakistan and Bangladesh there had been a war in the 70s. So, and that's the generation that many of the drivers, you know, they remember all of that. Or, you know, if we were meeting, you know, with Haitian drivers, we would make sure to be in more of a Dominican neighborhood. And part of this was important because at taxi garages, what the owners would do is, let's say they would dominate the workers there from like one particular ethnic group, and their backlist would always be of the ethnic group that they knew there'd be a conflict. So if the drivers had a spontaneous strike, right, they would feel that the people they'd call in to break it up would have a tension with each other to begin with, and less chances of solidarity. So, you know, I think overcoming some of those games, and the fact that, you know, politically, we're 94% immigrant, we're poor on top of that. There's an right? We cannot compete with the money of the bosses, and the taxi industry is notorious for being one of the most politically active industries in the entire city of New York. I mean, the bosses pay one lobbyist a monthly retainer that is more than what we pay to a staff person in an annual salary. And I'm not exaggerating. Like we see this in public records, you know. So you can't compete with that money. You have a taxi and limousine commission, the board was so stacked against us, and there's no law that requires any of these people to recognize us. And people are, you know, thanks to the leasing system, not only are you continually in debt, and therefore it's economically more difficult for people to take time out and organize and participate, but fundamentally you're pitted as competition against each other, right? The bosses have their profits guaranteed. The workers have to duke it out. And you know, one of the most dangerous professions in the country. I mean, time and again, we like are within the top 3 of the most of the workers that are most likely to be killed on the job. Back when we started, taxi drivers were 60 times more likely to be killed. Today, they're still 30 times more likely to be killed. So, and they're 80 times more likely to be robbed. I mean, I cannot tell you. I mean, you know, we've never had, you know, a month where we haven't gone to an emergency room, you know, or God forbid, a funeral. I mean, there have been, you know, so many. We had a member about a year recently who died when he was standing outside of the cab on a break, and we have less and less space in this public streets now, with all the bike lanes and bus lanes that don't consider the fact that workers that are laboring 12-hour shifts should have a human right to be able to pull over and take even a 10-minute break. So we had a member who's standing outside the cab and a speeding car hit him from behind, and you know, Mr. Hossein was killed. I mean, we've had such a tragic coincidence. Mir Hussein's roommate, Sajjad Matin, just 1 year prior to that, had less than a year prior to that, had his left leg amputated because he was similar. Sajjad was loading the trunk of the cab in Midtown, like 8 o'clock on a Thursday night, actually fairly light traffic at the time, and a speeding SUV operated by a drunk driver rammed into him. And you can imagine his roommate was one of the first people to find out about the accident. We could never have imagined that less than a year later, same accident would have then killed this man. So there's so many different dangers, from assaults to accidents, you know, that drivers face. And so the conditions themselves, right, the very things that make people rise up are also the very things that structure your immobility. And so being able to, you know, overcome that contradiction is a tremendous obstacle.
I heard about, you know, a documentary that somebody did with taxi drivers, and he was, I can't remember, but it was so hard to get a hold of. I couldn't find it anywhere. So just wondering if you had recommendations for things that we could watch or read to give us a better sense of what the issues are. And
Sure. Well, there is a great book called Taxi, Cabs, and Capitalism in New York City, which is written by Biju Matthew, who's also one of the founders of the Taxi Workers Alliance, and a great organizer. There's also our website, which actually has a lot of great resources on it. And Bill's daughter, Melanie, is multi-talented, is a fantastic videographer, and is our media person. And we have a YouTube channel with a lot of our videos on it. But also, I mean, just talking to drivers. Drivers are a tremendous, you know, source of information. And no, you didn't ask me this, but it's one thing I would just like to share. We actually had a really amazing victory recently. In last July, there was a vote by the Taxi and Limousine Commission to pass a fare raise. We had not had one in 8 years. Prior to that, there had not been one in 8 years. So we won in 2004 and then again now. What was the amazing thing is you've got all these like multi-million-dollar, right, taxi companies that were coming after us, and all the other corporations that are linked to this industry, you know, that have their interests in stealing the wages of the workers. They, you know, they're all lobbying heavily against us, but we were able to win a raise that for the first time in history was for the purpose of raising driver income and putting our real wages at a livable income standard. Secondly, as part of that vote, we won the first ever health and disability fund for taxi drivers in this country. And so we're now in the process of, you know, the city's going to be choosing the administrator. We're in the process process of applying to, you know, I mean, we conceptualized it, we mobilized for it, we won it. And it was a lot, it was, you know, it was a tremendous fight for many reasons, but, you know, one of them being that, you see, whenever there's a fair raise, historically, it's always been divided between some will go toward income for the workers, and then the rest of it goes toward the profits through raising the actual lease that the drivers have to pay. But now we have a third economic variable, which is taxi driver health and wellness benefits. And that itself changes the game at the bargaining table in our industry. And the fact that, I mean, I think organizations like ours and, you know, domestic workers, the fact that we're, you know, so, you know, passionately excluded from collective bargaining, but we've been able to find ways to be at the, you know, to bargain. I mean, the city recognizes us. They recently formed a task force on the industry, and, you know, the bosses trade association was in there, and we're in there. And it's like the first time in the 40-year history of leasing that you have labor institutionalized at the bargaining table. And that, you know, for us has, you know, I mean, it's the result of like, of our, you know, of our struggle and all the years of organizing. And it's the victory that, I mean, we're waiting for the day when in November the Health and Disability Fund actually gets to open its doors. And so Sajjad, when his leg was amputated, all he could get was something like $130 a week from workers' compensation. There was nothing else, you know, and I mean, his family literally became homeless at the time. And he had already moved his wife and kids back home because we hadn't had a raise in 8 years. People couldn't sustain themselves. And his wife came back from Bangladesh when she found out about the accident. And they had, you know, he was in the hospital. She had nowhere to live because he had been living with 3 other men. And so, you know, to be, now we can say to like all the Sajjads and Mir Hosseins and Kevin Fitzpatricks and all the people that we've loved through the years, that God forbid if we, you know, people feel, you know, they will no longer have to go from working poverty to, you know, crisis poverty, because we'll finally have a real sense of some benefits in this industry.